They were hyped as the Great White Hope promised champions who could finally topple the black legends dominating the ring in segregated America. Promoters sold them as heroes, the nation watched, and newspapers proclaimed their coming glory. But when the bell rang, history had other plans. One by one, these fighters fell short. Their legacies defined not by triumph, but by failure. Tonight, we're uncovering the stories of every white boxer who was supposed to rewrite history, but instead became a cautionary tale. From the hype to the heartbreak, this is the dark side of boxing that few remember, where race, fame, and expectation collided, and champions emerged to crush the dreams of the so-called Great White Hope. Tommy Morrison had it all: looks, devastating power, and fame.
I'm Tommy the Duke Morrison, a heavyweight with 24 knockouts, and I'm going to the top.
He even fought legends like Foreman and starred in Rocky V. But despite being boxing's golden boy, behind the Duke was a dark spiral that ruined everything. Addiction, denial, crimes. How did a boxer who hit such highs fall to such lows, only to have his life cut short at just 44 years old? Let's break it all down. Tommy Morrison started fighting as a child, displaying an early hunger for combat that would define his entire existence. At 13, he was sneaking into toughman contests using a fake ID, trading punches with grown men and winning 14 out of 15 times. His raw power, his grit, his hunger, it was all there, fully formed before he even hit high school. That early ferocity carried into the amateurs. Morrison dominated local circuits and won the prestigious Western Olympic trials in 1988. He was a top U.S. prospect until controversial split decision loss to future gold medalist Ray Mercer crushed his Olympic dreams. But instead of breaking him, it lit a fire. Then came the pro circuit, and Morrison tore through it like a wrecking ball. 28 straight wins, knockout after knockout.
I can't believe that Smoger is actually letting him get away with this. 4. That's it. That's it.
His destructive power became legendary throughout the boxing world, especially his explosive left hook that could end fights in an instant. He wasn't just winning, he was obliterating people.
I think Tommy is on his way. He's still learning, but he's improving from fight to fight.
Opponents feared facing him because of his combination of technical skill and devastating punching power. And in 1993, he reached the summit. A unanimous decision win over the legendary George Foreman to claim the WBO heavyweight title.
That Tommy Morrison has done his job.
This victory put him on top of the boxing world. Overnight, Morrison became a boxing superstar, but it didn't stop there. Hollywood wanted in. Sylvester Stallone handpicked him to play Tommy the Machine Gun in Rocky V, giving him a co-starring role alongside one of cinema's biggest action stars. He wasn't just a fighter anymore. He was a household name, an icon. He had money, he had charm, and the cameras loved him. Promoters dubbed him the Great White Hope, a crossover megastar who could revive American heavyweight boxing. But here's the thing. Success didn't save Tommy Morrison. It triggered something dark and destructive. Behind the magazine covers and movie roles was a man spiraling. His newfound celebrity status created what sources described as a limitless appetite for parties, liquor, and sex. One source said it flat out. He was out of control. Fame didn't fix him. It poured gasoline on every vice he had. The more he got, the faster he fell. Morrison's life followed a brutal pattern. Every rise was chased by an even steeper fall. After capturing the heavyweight title, his career looked unstoppable. Until it wasn't. In 1993, just months after beating George Foreman, he suffered a shocking knockout loss to Michael Bent. It wasn't just a setback, it was a collapse. That single defeat cost him a payday against Lennox Lewis that could have made him one of the highest-paid fighters on the planet. And just like that, the momentum was gone. He tried to claw his way back, but something darker was already waiting in the shadows. In February 1996, as he prepared for what was supposed to be his comeback fight, Morrison underwent a routine pre-fight blood test. What came back wasn't a fight cancellation, it was a death sentence. He had tested positive for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. The fallout was immediate and unforgiving. The diagnosis immediately and permanently ended his professional boxing career.
I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. Out in the open, can get just one person out there to take a more responsible attitude towards sex, then I feel I would have scored my biggest knockout ever.
Nevada's athletic commission yanked his license, and every major commission in the country followed suit. No appeals, no exceptions, no more fights. His career wasn't just over, it was erased. At a tearful press conference, Morrison faced the cameras and admitted his truth. He blamed his permissive, fast, and reckless lifestyle. He promised he'd never fight again.
I didn't do the right things. I led a very reckless lifestyle. Even though my career's over, I hope that in some way, shape, or form I can continue to step up and find a new, better way to educate people.
For a brief moment, it looked like he was facing his demons head-on. He even linked up with Magic Johnson to raise awareness about HIV, seemingly ready to use his platform for good. For the first time in a long time, Tommy Morrison looked like he might actually grow up, but it didn't last. Just weeks later, he made a complete U-turn. He quit taking his medication after just 30 days. He called it medical propaganda, then launched into full-blown denial. And from there, the spiral became unstoppable. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was the start of what one insider called a deep and intractable pattern of denial, a delusion that would define the rest of his life and ultimately end it. Soon, Morrison's denial wasn't just personal, it was public. He began claiming his original HIV test was false, insisting he had never actually contracted the virus despite multiple tests, and it didn't stop there. He started pushing dangerous conspiracy theories, claiming his diagnosis was orchestrated by a rival boxing promoter seeking to destroy his career, or even by government agencies working against him. His longtime promoter Tony Holden watched the spiral firsthand. He said Morrison became obsessed with fringe internet forums, buried in pseudoscience and paranoia. The more he searched, the deeper he fell. And denial came with a cost. The diagnosis didn't just strip him of his career, it ripped away the structure that had kept him afloat. The gym, the training camps, the discipline. Without boxing, Tommy Morrison had no anchor, and the result was predictable. He fell back into the same chaos that may have gotten him infected in the first place. His life quickly became what one source described as a shambles. No goals, no routine, no boundaries. And the truth is, this wasn't new behavior. Even before the diagnosis, Morrison had shown a troubling pattern of legal problems and self-destruction. Back in 1993, the same year he beat Foreman and became champion, he pleaded guilty to assaulting a college student. He also racked up public intoxication charges. While the cameras showed a rising star, the police reports told a different story. One of a man with a short fuse, a drinking problem, and a growing disregard for the law. After his boxing ban effectively ended his professional career, things got much worse. His legal troubles intensified, and his name began popping up in the news. But now, it was on police blotters, not fight cards. He was arrested repeatedly for driving under the influence across multiple states. And it didn't stop at alcohol. There were drug charges, weapons violations, dangerous stunts that put himself and others in serious danger. The Tommy Morrison that once electrified boxing was gone. In his place was a man spiraling deeper and deeper into chaos, dragging his legacy down with him. And just when you thought he couldn't fall any further, he did. By 1997, Morrison's free fall was no longer just sad, it was dangerous. That year, he was convicted of a DUI and other serious charges in Delaware County, Oklahoma, after a traffic accident that left 3 innocent people injured. This wasn't some tabloid scandal. This was real harm to real people. The court ordered him to attend a treatment facility, recognizing that his problems went beyond simple criminal behavior. But accountability didn't stick. That same year, Morrison faced separate DUI and speeding charges in Kansas. Somehow he walked away without serving time, thanks to legal technicalities and a good lawyer. But the message was clear. Even the justice system couldn't get through to him. And it didn't stop there. The destructive pattern continued throughout the 90s, and in July 1998, Morrison was arrested again, this time in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, for drunk driving and multiple other traffic violations. He was handed probation and a $2,200 fine he could barely afford. Not exactly a wake-up call. In fact, his Tulsa case was officially logged as his first true DUI conviction. The others, technically labeled driving while impaired. But that distinction meant nothing to the people whose lives he put at risk. Then came 1999, and the spiral went into overdrive. In September, Morrison was pulled over in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Police found cocaine, marijuana, and a loaded gun in his car. Just days earlier, he had been given a suspended sentence for his Tulsa case, a second chance, and he lit it on fire. That arrest proved one thing beyond doubt. Tommy Morrison wasn't just reckless, he was incapable of change. And by Thanksgiving of 1999, Tommy Morrison was crashing headfirst. That day, he was arrested yet again in Madison County, Arkansas, facing multiple serious complaints. The list of charges read like a rap sheet gone wild. Public intoxication, marijuana possession, criminal impersonation, and illegally concealing a weapon. But this wasn't just about bad behavior. It was about escalation. Because that gun charge was tied directly to his status as a convicted felon. And that made it a big deal. No more slaps on the wrist, no more technicalities. This time, it was serious. With multiple arrests piling up in quick succession, Morrison's bond was revoked on the spot. The former heavyweight champ was officially behind bars, waiting for a trial that would decide just how far he'd fallen. In January 2000, the verdict came down. He pleaded guilty to 2 drug charges from his September arrest in Fayetteville. The judge handed him a 10-year sentence, but suspended 8 of them. Instead, Morrison was sent to the Southwest Arkansas Community Correction Center in Texarkana for a 2-year stint, a shot at rehabilitation. He served most of that sentence with good behavior and was granted parole in February 2001. For a brief moment, it looked like he might finally slow down, but he couldn't help himself. Just 1 year later, in April 2002, a Tulsa County judge sentenced him to another year in jail, this time for violating probation from a previous drunk driving case. Technically, he didn't serve new time. He got credit for what he'd already done in Arkansas. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. Even after prison, Tommy Morrison still couldn't follow the most basic rules. Every now and then, he would break character. He'd admit the truth, if only for a moment. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," he once said. And he wasn't wrong. But recognition never turned into redemption. The pattern never changed. If anything, it got worse. When we talk about his brutal crimes, we're not talking about some hidden scandal or explosive criminal conspiracy. His brutality was slower, cumulative, self-inflicted, and socially dangerous. Over the years, he racked up multiple DUIs, was caught with illegal drugs and weapons, posing significant and ongoing threats to public safety. His most notorious incident left 3 innocent people hospitalized after a drunk driving crash, proof that his recklessness had real-world consequences. His drug use wasn't just whispered about either. According to multiple sources, Morrison was deep into cocaine and crystal meth, substances that fed the chaos and likely blocked any chance at meaningful change. Some reports even tossed around allegations of adultery, hinting at a broader moral unraveling. But unlike his criminal record, those stories remain unconfirmed. They were part of the swirling mess around his name, but not central to what truly defined his downfall. Because when you strip away the rumors and drama, his real crime was the life he refused to save. A man with talent, fame, and every opportunity to get help, who instead chose denial, destruction, and ultimately, a slow suicide in plain sight. Despite every red flag and a career-ending diagnosis that had been medically confirmed, Tommy Morrison still wasn't done with boxing. In the mid-2000s, years after Nevada and nearly every other state had revoked his license, he attempted an ill-advised comeback, recklessly putting himself and his opponents at risk. He somehow passed medical screenings in Arizona and managed to fight twice more. But those comebacks weren't really about competition. They were about validation. Morrison was desperate to prove he didn't have HIV. So desperate, in fact, that he invited the New York Times, yes, the New York Times, to oversee a medical test in 2007. Alongside that, he underwent 2 additional tests through a West Virginia sports authority. All 3 seemed to support his claim that he was HIV negative. But here's where it gets murky. Fast. Questions emerged immediately about the validity of the blood samples. Medical experts noted serious doubts about whether the samples even came from Morrison at all. His former agent, Randy Lang, flat out accused him of tampering with the results. He even claimed he had tested positive as recently as January 2007, and ringside physicians weren't buying it either. They pointed right back to the original 1996 tests, verified by multiple labs and confirmed by a pathologist. Those weren't false positives, they were hard medical facts, so why couldn't Morrison accept it? Part of the answer may lie in the intense stigma that came with his diagnosis. In interviews, Tommy talked openly about the isolation he felt. Friends avoided him. Gyms didn't want him around. Some people were so misinformed, they believed they could get HIV just by sweating near him. It was fear, pure, ignorant fear. And that fear, the way it warped how people treated him, may have fed his delusion. Deep down, maybe he needed to believe the tests were wrong. Maybe that was easier than accepting the truth. Even Magic Johnson, who had lived publicly with HIV for years, tried to step in. He encouraged Morrison to take the diagnosis seriously, to follow his doctor's orders, to take the medication that was keeping him alive. But Tommy refused, a critical and ultimately fatal error. By 2011, his denial had gone from personal to dangerous. He was telling reporters and anyone else who'd listen that HIV didn't exist, that no one had it, that it was all a lie. And with that, Tommy Morrison went from tragic figure to a potential threat, not just to himself, but to the people around him. It wasn't just denial anymore, it was delusion, and it would cost him everything. Just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. In the early 2000s, during one of the darkest stretches of his life, Morrison met Tricia Harding, the woman who would eventually become his wife. But instead of helping pull him out of the spiral, her presence seemed to accelerate it. According to multiple reports, his behavior shifted drastically after their relationship began, very differently, and not for good reasons, as one insider put it. Tricia fed into the fantasy. She publicly claimed that Morrison didn't have HIV at all. In her words, he was suffering from Guillain-Barré syndrome. It was a convenient narrative, and a dangerous one. By this point, he had completely abandoned his HIV treatment. No more antiretrovirals, no more doctors, just drugs, lots of them. He was reportedly using cocaine and crystal meth regularly, and it showed. His health began to collapse under the weight of his choices. What followed was a vicious cycle. Denial fed into drug use, which weakened his immune system, which made him sicker, further convincing him that something else must be wrong. The truth wasn't just avoided, it was erased. But this wasn't just his own personal delusion anymore. He still had a platform. People still listened, and that made his denialism a public threat. His claims that HIV didn't exist, that it was all a scam, could influence others, especially those newly diagnosed and scared. Even with overwhelming scientific evidence and direct intervention from Magic Johnson, someone who had lived with HIV for decades, Morrison refused to listen. He rejected every opportunity to survive. At this point, the story had stopped being sad. It had become maddening, because his fate wasn't sealed by the virus. It was sealed by his refusal to treat it. He directly accelerated his own physical decline and ultimately guaranteed his premature death. From 2001 onward, those close to him began noticing the change. His body was breaking down, slowly at first, then rapidly. By 2012, after a mysterious chest surgery, things took a dramatic turn. In his final year, he was bedridden, He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. A ventilator did his breathing for him. This once chiseled athlete, once the face of American heavyweight hope, had become unrecognizable. By age 40, people said he looked 60. A walking cautionary tale, aged by denial, addiction, and years of damage that couldn't be undone. Tommy Morrison died on September 1st, 2013, in a hospital in Omaha, Nebraska. He was just 44 years old. The official cause? Cardiac arrest brought on by multiple organ failure, septic shock, and a severe bacterial infection known as Pseudomonas aeruginosa septicemia, an infection typically seen in people with severely compromised immune systems. But here's where the story turns from tragedy to controversy. His death certificate made no mention of HIV, no mention of AIDS, nothing. That deliberate omission poured gasoline on the fire of public speculation. To many, it was the final chapter in a life defined by denial. Even in death, the narrative was being controlled. Yet the medical facts paint a different picture. Pseudomonas aeruginosa septicemia is a serious opportunistic infection, and one that, according to medical literature, most commonly affects individuals with advanced AIDS. The omission wasn't proof of innocence. It was a cover, a final attempt to erase the truth that Morrison had refused to accept for nearly 2 decades. And the denial didn't just come from paperwork. His wife, Tricia, continued to publicly claim that he had Guillain-Barré syndrome. She insisted HIV had nothing to do with his death. But Morrison's mother told a different story. In a heartbreaking interview with ESPN, she said plainly, "My son died of full-blown AIDS." 2 versions of reality. One shaped by love, loyalty, and delusion. The other grounded in grief and truth. And the ambiguity didn't end there. No autopsy was performed. His body was cremated quickly after his death. That meant no definitive medical confirmation, no way to silence the conspiracy theories, no way to rewrite the ending. And maybe that's the most fitting part of all this. Tommy Morrison spent the last years of his life running from reality, denying science, ignoring every warning, refusing every opportunity to take control of his fate. And when the final bell rang, he left behind a story just as chaotic, contradictory, and tragic as the life he lived. His death certificate, while medically accurate on the surface, told only half the story. Yes, he died of cardiac arrest, multiple organ failure, and a severe bacterial infection. But it left out the most crucial detail, the compromised immune system that made all of it possible. It was a final act of avoidance, one that mirrors Morrison's own refusal to accept reality. Medical experts agree, Pseudomonas aeruginosa septicemia doesn't just appear in healthy people. It preys on the immunodeficient. And in Morrison's case, that almost certainly meant AIDS. By choosing cremation and denying an autopsy, the family ensured that no definitive medical conclusion could ever be reached. No official record, no final reckoning. Just more silence, more speculation, more of the same carefully maintained illusion that had shaped the last decade of his life. And that's the bitter irony. After years of fighting the truth, Morrison's death certificate became his final weapon in that war, a document that, like its subject, refused to face what really happened. Tommy Morrison's story began like a movie script. Small-town kid with big dreams, knockout power, and matinee idol looks. He had the title. He had the fame. He even had a role in Rocky. He was on top of the world. But in 1996, his HIV diagnosis marked the beginning of a long, brutal downfall, one fueled by addiction, denial, and self-destruction. His arrest record, his drug abuse, and his reckless behavior didn't just damage his career, they put lives at risk. They showed a man unraveling in public view with no one strong enough or close enough to pull him back. His brutal crimes weren't bloody headlines. They were slow-motion tragedies, crimes of neglect, crimes of denial, and in the end, crimes that killed him. Because Morrison didn't just reject treatment, he rejected the very idea that he needed it. And it cost him everything at just 44 years old. Officially, it wasn't AIDS. But anyone who followed his life and understood the facts knows what really happened. Morrison's legacy is complicated. He was a gifted fighter, an American star, and a man who once seemed destined for greatness. But his story serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked personal demons, the powerful grip of addiction, and the dangerous allure of denial when faced with scientific truth. His life remains a poignant example of a duke who, in the end, lost the most important fight of all, the one against himself. But what do you think? Was Tommy Morrison a victim of stigma and bad advice? Or was he fully responsible for the path he chose? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. And if you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who thinks boxing is just about what happens in the ring. Because sometimes the real fight starts after the final bell. See you in the next one.
Larry Holmes.
Beating up everybody, 31 fights, beating Ernie Shavers, beating Kenny Norton.
There became something called the White Hope era. Plowboys, gandy dancers, ranchers, anyone of the right complexion who was 175 pounds or over was thought to be a challenger.
BC heavyweight champion of the world, Larry Holmes.
You remember the fight between Jerry Cooney and Larry Holmes, right? Come on, you must. It was only the biggest and most highly anticipated matchup of the early 80s. But do you remember the darker side of this contest? The disrespect, the insults, and even the outright racism Holmes had to put up with as champion to secure the biggest payday of his career? Not so clear? Then let's take a deeper look at the events leading up to it and remind ourselves of what went down as well as the role Cooney himself played in all the ugliness.
History.
Boom, perfect timing.
The heavyweight scene in the early 80s had gone stale. Ali was finished, Tyson was yet to burst onto the scene, and skilled as he was, the boxing public were not particularly enamored of Larry Holmes, the dominant heavyweight who had stepped in to fill the void. They were ready for someone new, someone fresh, and let's just say it, for a large part of America, someone white. And then suddenly there was Jerry Cooney, a hulking brute of a man with Catholic Irish heritage, and white America had its new hero. Despite his relative lack of experience, Cooney's clash with Holmes became inevitable as he was feted as the new Great White Hope. The buildup to the fight quickly became hugely divisive as promoters pushed the racial element. But how much of this came from Cooney himself and his own personal racist views? Let's see. Larry Holmes was one of the last men to fight Muhammad Ali and was the only man to stop him. His fight against Ali was his 8th defense of the title he had taken from Ken Norton over 2 years before, and by the time of the Ali fight, against a former champion who was clearly way past his best, Holmes had already established himself as the dominant heavyweight in the post-Ali era. The problem was, Holmes was no fan favorite. He wasn't helped by the quality of opposition he faced. He could only beat what was in front of him, and the standard of his opponents was far lower than boxing fans had grown accustomed to seeing in the previous decade during one of the golden eras of heavyweight boxing. That wasn't all, though. Holmes wasn't a particularly interesting champion, and compared to Ali, he had little charisma. As one boxing writer put it, Ali had a mouth that never stopped jabbering away, political significance, and sex appeal. Holmes lacked all three. But Holmes had another problem, too. He wasn't white. Remember, even in the early 1980s, the US was a country that was much more divided along racial lines than today, and the larger-than-life figure of Muhammad Ali had towered over boxing since his shock first win over Sonny Liston. Although he had plenty of fans, many others despised his brashness and his bravado, and they were happy to see the last of him. But Holmes wasn't the man they were hoping for. Yes, many white Americans yearned for a quieter, more humble champion. But more importantly, although not everyone would say it out loud, they wanted one with white skin. Enter Jerry Cooney. Cooney was brought up in a Catholic family with Irish roots and had been encouraged to take up boxing by his father. After a respectable but not stellar amateur career that ended with a record of 55-3, he turned pro and started making a name for himself by recording 9 knockouts in his first 10 outings. At 6'6" and with a big jab and a huge left hook, it was clear the kid had power. And this was something that served him well when he scored early knockout wins against Jimmy Young, and then Ron Lyle in his 23rd and 24th fights respectively. He was also a lefty who boxed in the orthodox stance, which gave him an even more powerful lead hand, although punches from his backhand were less effective. But after notching up these 2 marquee wins, he truly exploded into the public awareness when he defeated the still highly regarded former champion Kenny Norton by way of a first-round knockout in a fight that only lasted 54 seconds. Jerry Cooney had arrived. From that moment, Holmes and Cooney were set on a collision course because the public demanded it. People had seen how Cooney had dispatched of Norton, and they dreamed of seeing him do the same thing to Holmes, a champion they felt apathetic about at best. And so promoters and managers started working to put the fight on. From the beginning, there was always a certain amount of genuine animosity, at least on Larry Holmes' side. Although he was champion, Holmes felt he was never given the respect he deserved, and due to the lack of exciting opponents for him to face, he had never been able to earn the kind of money he felt he was due. As Holmes stayed active, defeating Trevor Berbick, Leon Spinks, and Ronaldo Snipes, Cooney's team stalled, likely protecting Cooney against the possibility of a loss following the big Norton win. Cooney ended up staying out of the ring for 13 months before the fight took place, and during this period, Holmes wouldn't hear any talk of a future bout with Cooney. At one point, while interviewing Holmes after his victory over Spinks, sports journalist Howard Cosell tried to bring Cooney in to talk to Holmes. This severely aggravated Holmes, and he was heard telling Cosell, "Howard, I'm gonna slap his face if you bring him over here, and I don't even want to talk about a Cooney until he put his name on a contract." He then made to attack Cooney before he was dragged away by his handlers. In other interviews, Holmes remarked of Cooney that if he wasn't white, he wouldn't be nothing, which was probably quite a fair comment, but it showed that there was always a racial element to the matchup. Holmes felt he had worked hard for everything he had, and he was resentful that Cooney was being gifted a place at the top table just because of his race. But the promoters, especially Don King, took the race angle and ran with it. For sure, Cooney was hugely popular, and a large part of this was because of the color of his skin. But it was King primarily that began pushing the Great White Hope narrative, and the public lapped it up, and so did the press. In the buildup, it was Cooney who was featured on the covers of Time and Sports Illustrated magazines instead of the champion, and to secure the fight, Holmes had to agree to an even split of the purse, even though the champ usually receives the larger share. This allowed Cooney to goad his opponent, telling him, "You need me more than I need you," which, in light of Holmes's previous purses, seemed to have an element of truth to it. The bout was to be the richest fight in boxing history, with both fighters taking home a reported $10 million. Despite the even split, it would still represent Holmes's biggest payday by far, so he had to swallow the taunts and simply consider the money. As the fight drew closer, the racial element to the clash became more overt. Members of Cooney's entourage were seen wearing t-shirts that read, "Not the white man, but the right man." And celebrities got involved too, with Sylvester Stallone seen socializing with Cooney and his team. Okay, nobody's saying that Stallone talking to Cooney necessarily had anything to do with race, but what about this? On the night, a direct telephone line to the White House was installed in Cooney's dressing room, so then President Ronald Reagan could call him to congratulate him after the fight should he win. No such line was installed in Holmes's changing room. In any case, the promotional tactics worked because excitement and anticipation reached fever pitch. On the night, the arena was packed out and millions more tuned in from 150 countries around the world to watch, setting records as one of the biggest closed-circuit television and pay-per-view events ever. Before the fight, white supremacists had threatened to kill Holmes, and black activists had responded by saying they would be there on the night, ready to retaliate if anything happened to their man. On the night of the fight, This led to snipers being placed on the roofs of all the Vegas hotels surrounding Caesar's Palace, where the fight was to take place. And then, even as the fight was about to start, Holmes was subjected to further indignity when his name was announced first, breaking with the time-honored tradition that the challenger's name be announced first and the champion's second. Was all this just innocent, or was the white fighter receiving unjustified preferential treatment? You decide. And then the fight was on, and the two undefeated heavyweights finally faced off in the ring. Despite the fractious build-up when the fighters touched gloves, Holmes was heard saying to Cooney, "Let's have a good fight." And for much of the fight, that's exactly what they did. Throughout his career, Cooney had made a name for himself as an early round knockout artist, and many expected him to come for Holmes from the first bell. But Holmes turned that script on his head and had Cooney on the canvas before the end of the second. To his credit, Cooney beat the count and took the fight to Holmes, landing some heavy blows to Holmes's body, notably in the fourth. But by the later rounds, Holmes began to take over as Cooney's inexperience and inactivity began to show.
Fatigued in Larry Holmes. That's why there's no movement. Larry Holmes is in trouble.
After fighting on gamely with a cut near one eye, Cooney's corner finally pulled him out near the end of the 13th as Holmes was moving in to close the show. And even then, the bias towards Cooney was apparent. Although to any neutral observer, Holmes was winning clearly, Cooney would still have been ahead on the judges' scorecards had he not been docked 3 points for low blows he threw in the later rounds before his corner saved him. After the fight, Cooney took the loss badly and broke down apologizing to his fans on the mic in the post-fight interview. He had clearly felt the full weight of all the pressure that had been placed on his shoulders, and he was never the same fighter again. Yes, he boxed on, but he only fought 5 more times in the next 8 years, retiring after back-to-back losses against Michael Spinks and then an aging George Foreman with a final record of 28-3, with 24 wins coming by way of knockout. In the following years, Cooney seemed to avoid fighting as much as he could. With the money he received from the Holmes fight, he was set for life and spent more time in nightclubs than in the training gym. Later, he spent more time battling an unhealthy relationship with alcohol than he did battling opponents in the ring. He seemed crushed psychologically, and despite the promise he showed in beating Young, Lyle, and Norton, he never came close to fulfilling his potential. The tragedy was that it could have been so different for him. After the string of eye-catching victories that led to the Holmes fight and his subsequent labeling as the Great White Hope, he was pushed into a fight he wasn't ready for. In truth, he was largely unknown and untested when he faced Holmes. Before that fight, he had knocked over most men who stood in front of him, so his heart, chin, and stamina had never been tested. While Holmes had remained busy, Cooney had been kept out of the ring because his handlers didn't want to risk a loss that would jeopardize their huge payday. So once the fight started, after Holmes had safely navigated the first few rounds, his superior experience and conditioning meant the fight became easier and easier for him the deeper it went. Interestingly, Holmes himself said that with maybe just 6 months more experience, Cooney would have made it a much harder fight and may even have been able to beat him. Holmes, who also faced the likes of Ernie Shavers, Ken Norton, and Mike Tyson in his career, rated Cooney as one of the biggest hitters he faced. Cooney too believed that with another couple of years of experience, he would have beaten Holmes, but as it was, he was never able to overcome the psychological scars he suffered that night to become the fighter he could have been. But was Cooney a racist? No. Although Don King promoted the fight along racial lines, and Holmes made comments that, while not outright racist, contained a racial element, Cooney never had any part in it. His Great White Hope label made him uncomfortable, and despite his team embracing it, he distanced himself from it. Cooney believed that a fight comes down to nothing more than the skill of the two boxers in the ring. They train, they face off, and they fight, and the best man emerges victorious at the end. It has nothing to do with race. Why should it? And for his part, Holmes didn't really play up to the racial aspect of the fight, rising above it and holding similar beliefs to Cooney about a boxing match having nothing to do with color. The boxers fight in the ring, and the pressure and all the noise come from outside. After the fight, the two boxers became lifelong friends, and they remain close to this day. And after sharing the ring in such a racially charged bout that was largely thrust upon them, perhaps that is the most fitting end to the story. What do you think? Should Holmes have been given more respect while he was active? At least he certainly has it now, long into his retirement. And do you think Cooney should have achieved more? Or was he just what we probably now call a hype job? We'd love to hear your thoughts about these questions or anything else in this video, so please let us know in the comments below. And if you like the video, please don't forget to hit the like button and give us a follow before you leave to help us keep producing more boxing content like this for you in the future. See you in the next one.
Jerry Quarry gave everything to boxing, and it gave him nothing in return. Instead, it took everything: his health, his legacy, and ultimately, his life. He fought the best heavyweights in history, went toe-to-toe with legends, and for a moment, he seemed destined for greatness. But instead of becoming a champion, he became a tragedy. What really happened to the Bellflower Bomber? And how did his life take such a heartbreaking turn? He was given a label he never wanted, suffered a career-defining loss, and in the end, boxing destroyed him. A man who could have held the heavyweight crown but was doomed by the very sport that made him famous. And the way he lived was tragic. But the way he died? Even worse. Because Jerry Quarry's story isn't about what he won. It's about what he lost. He had the power. He had the skill. He had the heart. But his life wasn't a tale of triumph. It was a disaster waiting to happen. He was supposed to be boxing's next big superstar. A powerhouse with dynamite in his fists, a chin made of steel, and the kind of toughness that made crowds roar. But instead of holding up championship belts, he ended up holding the short end of the stick. Because Quarry didn't just fight in any era, he fought in a nightmare. Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Ken Norton, all-time greats, all at their peak. And Quarry? He was stuck in the middle of that murderer's row, fighting his heart out just to stay afloat. And when boxing fans look back, his name isn't remembered with the champions. It's remembered with the casualties. But who was he before the fame? Before the brutal wars that left him broken? Before boxing robbed him of everything? His career? His body? His mind? To understand his tragic end, we first have to go back to the beginning. Jerry Quarry wasn't just born into boxing. He was bred for it. Born on May 15, 1945 in Bakersfield, California, he came from a family that lived and breathed boxing. His father and brothers were all fighters, and in the Quarry household, boxing gloves might as well have been part of the school uniform. It wasn't just a sport for them. It was a way of life. For little Jerry, there was no plan B. It was either make it in the ring or get swallowed up by the same working-class struggles that shaped his childhood. Grit and toughness weren't traits. They were requirements. And from the moment he laced up his gloves, it was clear he had something special. Quarry seemed destined for the ring. As an amateur, he tore through the competition. By the time he was 19, he won the 1965 National Golden Gloves Heavyweight Championship, a title that had launched the careers of legends. With speed, power, and a chin that could take bombs. He wasn't just a prospect, he was a problem. People saw him as a future world champion, a fighter built for greatness. But here's the thing, boxing doesn't care about potential. And Quarry had the worst timing imaginable. Because just as he was climbing the ranks, he walked straight into the most dangerous heavyweight era in history. Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Ken Norton. All killers, all in their prime. This wasn't just a tough time to be a contender. It was a horror movie. Could Jerry break through? Or was he just another name on their hit list, destined to be remembered not as a champion, but as a stepping stone for legends? In the late 1960s and early 1970s, an era where boxing was still racially divided, boxing was dominated by black heavyweights with Ali, Frazier, and Foreman at the top of the division. And in the midst of it all, the media slapped a label on Jerry Quarry that he never asked for and never wanted. The Great White Hope. This wasn't just a nickname or marketing term. It carried weight, ugly racial undertones that turned Quarry into something he had no desire to be, a symbol in a fight he never signed up for. He wasn't trying to restore anything. He didn't care about being the face of white America's boxing dreams. He just wanted to fight, to win, to make a name for himself. But the media and promoters used it to push a narrative that a white boxer could take back the heavyweight crown. And once that label was on him, there was no shaking it. Wherever he went, it followed him into the ring. It didn't matter who he fought, the storyline was always the same. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was carrying the expectations of an entire race. For Quarry, this was a nightmare. But despite the unwanted attention, he never let the pressure break him. He was tough as nails. He had speed, skill, and knockout power. His record spoke for itself. Wins over top contenders, highlight reel knockouts, and an iron will that made him a fan favorite. He earned respect the hard way and wasn't afraid of anyone. He stepped into the ring with legends. He fought Muhammad Ali twice, Joe Frazier twice, and battled dangerous opponents like Ron Lyle, Ernie Shavers, and Ken Norton. But no matter how good Quarry was, he had one fatal flaw. He took too much punishment. He could dish it out, but he could take it too. And that was the problem. Because in boxing, toughness is a gift until it becomes a curse. Some fights leave a mark on a career, others leave a scar that never fades. For Jerry Quarry, his 1970 bout against George Chuvalo was one of those nights. This is the fight that still sparks debate to this day. He was in control, winning on the scorecards, outboxing Chuvalo, doing everything right. And then came the 7th round. Chuvalo landed a brutal left hook. Quarry went down, but he wasn't out. He got back to his feet, took a knee to gather himself, and then stood up just before the count of 10. But before he could even steady himself, the fight was over. Referee Zach Clayton had already made his decision. He waved it off. A knockout victory for Chuvalo. Quarry was stunned. The crowd erupted in outrage. His corner was furious. To many it looked like a robbery. Quarry had beaten the count. He followed the rules. But the referee called it a stoppage anyway. He felt cheated, robbed of a win that should have been his. And in a career filled with brutal fights, this one hurt the most, not just physically, but mentally. But if Quarry thought this was the worst heartbreak of his career, he had no idea what was coming next. Jerry Quarry's career wasn't just tough. It was a war zone. He fought in an era where sparring wasn't safe. Fighters didn't use headgear, and training wasn't about sharpening skills. It was about proving how much punishment you could take. Fighters prided themselves on toughness. He sparred with legends, took unnecessary damage before the fights even started. And when he stepped into the ring, he didn't just try to win. He tried to out-tough everyone and absorb punishment instead of avoiding it. Against some fighters, that worked. But in his wars with Ali, Frazier, and Foreman, it was a death sentence. Ali cut him to shreds in both fights. Frazier's relentless pressure wore him down. Foreman's devastating power left permanent damage. Quarry's biggest problem wasn't just the competition. It was himself. His fearless style made him exciting, but against elite heavyweights, it was suicide. Each time, he walked away bloodied but unbroken, until eventually the damage caught up with him. Each loss took a piece of him. Each war in the ring took a little more out of his body and mind. And in the end, there was nothing left. Like so many fighters before him, he didn't know when to walk away. By the mid-70s, he was a shell of himself. The years of punishment took their toll, but Quarry, ever the warrior, kept stepping back into the ring. Not because he should, but because he didn't know how to stop, and the world didn't do him any favors. With no financial safety net and no real long-term support, Quarry's post-fight career was a downward spiral. The money ran out. The opportunities dried up. And when boxing is all you've ever known, what else do? You keep fighting, even when your body is screaming at you to stop. And that's exactly what he did. Then, in 1992, at 47 years old, Quarry did the unthinkable. He stepped into the ring one last time. There was nothing left for him to prove, nothing left for him to gain. But he climbed in, chasing a version of himself that no longer existed. And what happened next was brutal. The damage was clear. He was slow. His reflexes were gone. His body couldn't take it anymore. And worst of all, his mind was already slipping. He lost that comeback fight in devastating fashion. It should have never been sanctioned, but it was, and it only pushed Quarry further down the road to tragedy. The real tragedy of Jerry Quarry's life wasn't just in his losses, it was in what boxing did to him outside the ring. All those fights, all those punches, the wars, the countless rounds of training with no headgear, they left him broken. By his late 40s, the damage was undeniable. Dementia pugilistica, a condition we now know as CTE, had already set in. His speech was slurred, his memory was fading. He struggled with basic tasks. By his 50s, he could barely take care of himself. His family did what they could, but there was only so much anyone could do. This once great fighter who had stood toe-to-toe with legends couldn't even remember the battles he fought. The same chin that had made him famous, the same toughness that made fans love him, had betrayed him in the end. On December 28, 1998, Jerry Quarry was hospitalized with pneumonia. Years of fighting had worn him down. His body was weak, his mind was gone, his strength had faded, and his once indestructible chin couldn't fight off time. 6 days later, on January 3, 1999, Jerry Quarry was gone. He died of cardiac arrest at just 53 years old. A man who was once the toughest of the tough, the fighter who had once been the hope of boxing, had been reduced to nothing by the very sport he loved. Jerry Quarry was never a world champion, but he was more than just another contender. He was one of the toughest men to ever step into a ring. He fought everyone. He never backed down. He gave boxing everything he had, but his career wasn't a success story. It was a cautionary tale, one that shows the dark side of boxing. The price of taking too much damage. The dangers of refusing to walk away. It was a warning. And in the end, it cost him everything. Because boxing wasn't just Jerry Quarry's profession. It was his executioner. It built him up, broke him down, and left him with nothing. No championship, not a legacy, just pain. And then it took his life too. Jerry Quarry's story is one of talent, tragedy, and wasted potential. He fought in the wrong era against the wrong opponents, but he never backed down from a challenge. If he had fought in a different era with better medical care and an emphasis on defense, things might have been different. But boxing wasn't built for safety back then. It was built for warriors, and Quarry was one of them. His death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a reminder of what happens when the sport gives too much and takes even more. So, what do you think? Should Jerry Quarry be remembered as one of the greatest never to win a title? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the tragic lives of boxing legends, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Thanks for watching. He knocked down Muhammad Ali with a single punch. The crowd roared. The nation cheered. But no one talks about what happened after. Henry Cooper became a British icon. And then he lost it all. His belts, his money, his mind. How could someone so widely adored end up selling his most cherished possessions just to stay afloat? His story isn't just about that famous punch that nearly changed boxing history. It's about what happened when the gloves came off for good. The date was June 18, 1963. Wembley Stadium buzzed with excitement. In one corner stood a brash young American named Cassius Clay, later known as Muhammad Ali. In the other corner was Britain's own Henry Cooper, affectionately known as our Henry by his adoring fans. Clay had arrived in London bursting with his trademark confidence. He publicly dismissed Cooper as a bum, a nothing fighter not worth his time. The British public rallied behind Cooper, their national hero, facing this loud-mouthed American upstart. What unfolded that night would become one of boxing's most talked-about moments. The opening round saw Cooper surprising everyone. Instead of backing down, he took an aggressive approach against the typically fast-starting Clay. By the third round, though, Clay's punches began finding their mark. Cooper suffered a cut above his left eye. Blood was flowing. But then came the fourth round. With just seconds remaining, Cooper unleashed his signature left hook, the punch affectionately known as Henry's hammer. The crowd watched in disbelief as Clay crashed to the canvas. The future heavyweight champion of the world was down. Clay was visibly shaken, but the bell rang. He was saved by the timekeeper. What happened next would haunt Cooper for decades. As Clay returned to his corner, his trainer Angelo Dundee got to work. Observers claimed Dundee administered smelling salts, which was against British boxing rules. But more significantly, Dundee pointed out a split in Clay's right glove to the referee, claiming it needed to be replaced. This led to a delay while officials were consulted about getting a new pair of gloves. Cooper always maintained this pause lasted a minute or more. Precious recovery time for Clay. But records and fight footage tell a different story. The official timekeeper documented an extension of only 6 seconds beyond the standard interval. The controversy that would become known as Glovegate was born. Cooper believed until his dying day that he'd been robbed of his greatest victory. Years later, Dundee himself admitted in interviews and his memoir that he had deliberately widened a pre-existing tear in the glove to buy Clay those crucial extra seconds. Some boxing experts saw this as classic cornerman cunning, doing whatever it took to protect his fighter. Others, like promoter Frank Warren, questioned whether Dundee had really tampered with the glove at all. When the fifth round began, a revitalized Clay came out swinging. He unleashed a barrage of punches that opened a severe cut above Cooper's already damaged left eye. The bleeding was so bad that the referee had no choice but to stop the fight. Clay was declared the winner. Cooper's moment of glory had slipped away. Despite the loss, the fight turned Cooper into a national star. The British public loved him even more for knocking down the man who would soon become the greatest heavyweight in history. But while Cooper's fame grew, his fortunes would not follow the same path. When he finally hung up his gloves in 1971, he faced a challenge perhaps tougher than any opponent in the ring: making a living outside it. While beloved by fans across Britain, he quickly discovered that popularity didn't pay the bills. His attempts to secure his financial future proved disastrous. He tried his hand at running a greengrocer shop in Wembley. The venture failed spectacularly, costing him around £10,000, a substantial sum in those days. Not one to give up easily, Cooper later invested in a health club business. This too collapsed, leaving him teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. To survive financially, Cooper had to return to public life in the 1970s. He became the face of Brut Cologne in a series of television commercials with the memorable catchphrase, "Splash it all over." The campaign was hugely successful. Brut became the world's best-selling cologne during that period. But behind the smiling face on television screens across Britain lurked growing financial worries. He made numerous public appearances and worked as an after-dinner speaker, trading on his fame to rebuild his finances. But his business judgment continued to fail him. He reportedly associated with individuals in the British betting world and incurred losses in ventures related to gambling promotions and private health clubs. The financial blows kept coming. Cooper served as a company director for an insurance firm that faced investigation following the disappearance of funds. Most devastating of all, he suffered heavy losses in the Lloyd's of London insurance market, a financial disaster that forced him to auction off his cherished Lonsdale Championship belts for £42,000. Picture that moment. A boxing legend having to part with the physical symbols of his greatest achievements just to stay afloat. For Cooper, those belts represented years of sacrifice, pain, and triumph. Now they were gone, sold off to cover the mounting debts from his failed business ventures. But Cooper's fall wasn't just financial, it was personal. Selling his Lonsdale belts wasn't a business decision. It was a silent scream. Those belts represented everything: the sweat, the blood, the roar of Wembley. To give them up was to admit that none of it had been enough, not to save his future, not to protect his legacy, not to spare him from humiliation. And yet, even as he faded from the spotlight, the pain only deepened. The boxing establishment he gave his life to? Silent. The fans who once adored him? Powerless. Cooper felt used, discarded, and betrayed. Beyond the financial turmoil, a different Henry Cooper was emerging behind closed doors. The man the public knew as ever-smiling Our Henry was changing. Friends and family members described a man who became short-tempered during the 1970s, particularly when his business ventures failed. His son, Henry Marco, even hinted at his father's moody and brooding nature, a stark contrast to his widely perceived friendly public image. The loss of identity that came with retiring from a high-profile career, combined with mounting financial stress, took a considerable psychological toll. Retirement represents a major life transition for anyone, but for athletes who've spent decades in the spotlight, the change can be especially brutal. The contrast between his public persona and his private struggles highlights the hidden battles that even celebrated figures endure. While fans saw the charming boxer who knocked down Muhammad Ali, his family saw a man fighting a different kind of battle, one with no referee to stop the match when the bleeding got too severe. Cooper's relationship with boxing authorities also soured dramatically. He openly voiced his resentment, accusing the British boxing establishment of neglecting retired fighters while prioritizing their own profits. One particular source of anger was the British Boxing Board of Control's refusal to sanction a proposed world title fight against Jimmy Ellis in 1968. This decision deeply frustrated Cooper and his manager. It may have been his best shot at becoming world champion, a title that ultimately eluded him throughout his career. The final straw came with his controversial loss to Joe Bugner in 1971, Cooper's last professional fight. The defeat cost Cooper his British, Commonwealth, and European titles. He felt the decision was unfair and fueled his growing disillusionment with how the sport was governed. This tension between Cooper and the boxing establishment reflected a broader issue that exists in many sports: the question of what governing bodies owe to the athletes who sacrifice their health and well-being for entertainment and profit. Cooper used his platform to advocate for better treatment of boxers after retirement, though his approach was often colored by personal bitterness. By the 1980s, Cooper was a far cry from the beloved figure who had stood tall against Muhammad Ali. Financial ruin had forced him to sell his most treasured possessions. His public appearances were now his primary source of income. The belt auction symbolized his fall, selling his glorious past just to survive his troubled present. The always smiling Our Henry had been replaced by a man carrying deep resentments. He felt cheated by Ali's corner in 1963. He felt abandoned by the boxing authorities who had profited from his blood and sweat. He felt betrayed by business associates who had led him into financial disasters. The accumulation of these grievances transformed him from a national treasure into a cautionary tale. For younger generations who never saw Cooper fight, it might be hard to grasp just how beloved he once was. The British public adored him not just for his boxing prowess, but for his perceived humility and working-class roots. He represented a certain ideal of British masculinity: tough but fair, determined but respectful. This made his bitter complaints later in life all the more jarring for those who remembered his glory days. The Glovegate controversy took on mythical proportions in British boxing folklore. Cooper clung to it as an explanation for why greatness had slipped through his fingers. Had Dundee not interfered, had the referee enforced the rules more strictly, Had those precious seconds not been granted to Clay, perhaps Cooper's life might have taken an entirely different trajectory. This narrative of being wronged became central to Cooper's identity in his later years. His story stands as a stark reminder of how quickly fortunes can change once the roar of the crowd fades. The transition from active athlete to retired sportsman claimed yet another victim. Without the structure, purpose, and income that boxing provided, Cooper struggled to find his footing in the wider world. Many athletes of his generation found themselves similarly adrift when their careers ended. Even in his darkest moments, Cooper maintained a connection with the boxing community and the broader public. His endorsement work with Brut Cologne made him a fixture in British homes via television commercials. His after-dinner speaking kept him relevant and provided some income. But these were pale shadows of his former glory, reminders of what had been lost rather than signs of continued success. For Cooper, retirement wasn't just the end of his boxing career, it was the beginning of a difficult chapter marked by financial hardship, mental health challenges, and increasing isolation from the sport he loved. His story serves as a sobering counterpoint to the glamour and excitement that surrounds active boxers. The physical toll of boxing often receives attention: the brain damage, the broken bones, the long-term health consequences. But Cooper's experience highlights the emotional and financial damage that can follow. The abrupt transition from adored public figure to struggling former athlete proved nearly as devastating as any punch he took in the ring. Cooper's relationship with Muhammad Ali evolved over time. Despite the bitterness surrounding their first encounter, Cooper maintained respect for Ali's abilities. They fought again in 1966 with Ali, now champion, winning more decisively. There was no controversy this time, no torn glove to fuel conspiracy theories. But the memory of that first fight and the sense of what might have been never left him. Ali himself acknowledged Cooper's skills, later calling him the toughest fighter I ever met, high praise from the greatest heavyweight champion in history. This mutual respect existed alongside Cooper's continued belief that he had been robbed of his greatest victory by Angelo Dundee's gamesmanship. In many ways, Cooper became defined by that single punch, that one moment when he nearly changed boxing history. The left hook that floored Cassius Clay became both his greatest achievement and his heaviest burden, a reminder of how close he came to immortality. And maybe that's the real tragedy of Henry Cooper. He didn't die in the ring. He died slowly, invisibly, chipped away by debt, regret, and a system that never looked back once the cameras stopped rolling. He wasn't just a boxer. He was a warning. Because for every young fighter chasing glory today, Cooper's story is a reminder. The knockouts aren't the end. Sometimes they're just the beginning. But his story is not just about boxing or finances, it's about identity. When the thing that defines you is suddenly gone, what remains? For Cooper, the answer wasn't always pleasant. His financial troubles weren't just about money. They represented a loss of control. The man who had once commanded the respect of the boxing world found himself at the mercy of creditors, business partners, and financial institutions. Despite everything, Henry Cooper remains an indelible figure in British sporting history. He represents something uniquely British: the noble loser, the underdog who nearly toppled the giant, the working-class hero who reached for greatness but fell just short. His story resonates because it contains both triumph and tragedy. The triumph of that famous left hook, the tragedy of what followed after the final bell. Cooper never became world champion, but in the eyes of the British public, he was always a champion, a flawed, human champion whose struggles outside the ring proved harder to overcome than any opponent he faced within it. Henry Cooper may have been left with nothing in material terms. The belts were sold. The money was gone. The glory faded. But in the memory of British boxing fans, in the history of the sport, and in the enduring image of that famous left hook sending the greatest floating to the canvas, Henry Cooper left an impression that no financial disaster could erase. He may have been knocked down by life after boxing, but in the hearts of the British people, our Henry remains forever standing. What do you think? Did Henry Cooper get the respect he deserved, or was he just another fighter the sport left behind? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. We've got more on the way. See you in the next one. As we've seen, the Great White Hope was never just about boxing. It was about expectations, history, and a nation trying to rewrite the rules. These fighters stepped into the ring carrying the weight of fame, race, and impossible pressure. And one by one, they fell short. Their stories remind us that legacy isn't just about who wins, it's about the fights they couldn't escape, both inside and outside the ropes. Which of these White Hopes do you think deserved a second chance or could have changed history if circumstances were different? Comment below and let us know. And if you want more untold stories from boxing's past, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because the ring has more secrets waiting. And you won't want to miss a single one.